The late 1960s were roaring with change. Television screens flickered with rebellion, fashion, and the new pulse of youth. But no star stirred hearts and fears quite like Elvis Presley. After years of Hollywood movies and studio recordings, he returned to the stage in a blaze of energy, reclaiming the spotlight with a presence that made the world hold its breath. Fans wept with joy at every swivel of his hips, every electrifying note, seeing in him freedom, passion, and the raw power of music unbound. But not everyone cheered. Across the country, conservative voices whispered and shouted warnings. Some called him corrupting, dangerous, even sinful. In churches from Memphis to Atlanta, sermons warned of the boy from Tupelo leading youth astray. And on a live television broadcast that would etch itself into history, one preacher's words cut through the glamour like a blade. His music is from the devil. The studio went silent. Cameras lingered on Elvis's face, waiting for anger, denial, scandal. Something explosive. But what came next stunned the nation. Calm, unwavering, and impossibly human, he spoke. And in his words, a floodgate opened. A story of faith, struggle, and music as salvation. In that instant, millions were forced to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the man, the music, and the moment itself. Some felt scandalized, some felt healed, and everyone knew they were witnessing history. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The late 1960s in America carried a peculiar tension in the air, a charged energy that could almost be tasted. Cities hummed with the pulse of change, civil rights marches, anti-war protests, and the rise of a youth culture that refused to be silent. Amid all this, Elvis Presley was returning, not as the Hollywood heartthrob whose movies had filled theaters with light and laughter, but as a man reclaiming his stage, his music, and his very identity. The '68 comeback special wasn't just a performance, it was a proclamation. Elvis was back, alive in a way that neither film sets nor studio sessions could contain. From the opening notes, his presence filled every corner of the room, commanding attention with an intensity that drew shivers from the audience, young and old alike. For fans who had waited through years of absence, it was more than a concert. It was a revival, a testament to the raw, almost spiritual power of music to awaken, to shake, to transcend. Yet even as millions cheered, a quieter, colder voice whispered disapproval from the margins of American life. In the Deep South, conservative religious leaders watched with suspicion, their Sunday sermons increasingly warning of the perils that Presley's gyrations and crooning posed to impressionable youth. Newspapers carried stories that juxtaposed adoration with alarm. Headlines screamed provocatively, "Elvis, the devil's instrument?" Some editorials were nearly apocalyptic, painting his music as the precursor to moral decay. Church bulletins cautioned parents, and letters flooded editors' desks, alternately decrying his influence or defending the freedom to enjoy art, untainted by fear. In towns like Jackson and Birmingham, small groups gathered in front of theaters, waving pamphlets that implored the community to resist the temptations of sin, arriving on stage with Elvis Presley. Within this cultural friction, one announcement in particular sent ripples through the nation. A prominent televangelist, known for his fiery sermons and widely read columns, declared he would appear live on a popular variety show, not merely to speak, but to confront Presley directly. The network, wary yet intrigued, scheduled the segment for prime time, aware that it promised ratings, but also that it was entering unpredictable territory. For many Americans, it was a moment fraught with curiosity, anticipation, and unease. The stage, usually a place of spectacle and applause, was about to become an arena where ideology, faith, and artistry collided. Backstage, Elvis moved through the haze of smoke and warm lights, his thoughts a mixture of focus and reflection. He was acutely aware that this return was more than a personal triumph. It was a cultural statement. He had grown up in Tupelo, Mississippi, and then Memphis, in neighborhoods where gospel choirs filled Sunday mornings with the voices of heaven. His mother had sung softly while he drifted off to sleep. His father had played a rhythm guitar in the evenings, and from those tender lessons of melody and harmony, a foundation had formed, one of faith, passion, and expression. Now, on the precipice of national scrutiny, he carried that heritage with him like a quiet armor. The tension backstage was palpable. Assistants scurried about, adjusting microphones, passing water, offering last-minute words of encouragement. Cameras loomed, lenses reflecting the sharp fluorescence above, and the crew moved with practiced efficiency. But the air felt heavier than usual. Conversations were clipped, eyes darting to the monitor that displayed the studio audience waiting, thousands of eyes filled with expectation, some gleaming with admiration, others narrowing in suspicion. And through it all, Elvis remained calm, his focus inward, his hands clasped loosely at his side, a subtle rhythm coursing through him like the heartbeat of a city that both revered and reviled him. The contrast was stark. On one side of the cultural divide were teenagers and young adults, eyes bright with fascination, dancing along to the idea of freedom that Presley embodied. They saw in him not a mere entertainer, but a beacon of vitality, a conduit for rebellion and joy, for unfiltered expression at a time when conformity still clung tightly to tradition. They held tickets in their hands, posters on walls, and hearts alight with anticipation, believing in the cathartic power of music to unite and inspire. On the other side stood conservative families, church groups, and editorial boards, eyes narrowed with suspicion, fearing that each swing of a hip, each soulful note, was a siren call leading the youth away from God and toward moral compromise. They whispered among themselves, citing scripture and prudence, convinced that the stage could be a battlefield for the soul of a generation. And in the tension between these two extremes, America itself seemed to hold its breath, poised on the edge of something neither wholly understood nor easily dismissed. As the cameras rolled and the bright lights clicked on, the audience erupted in applause, the energy bouncing between anticipation and fear, admiration and judgment. Journalists scribbled furiously, capturing every smile, every frown, every hint of movement that might signal how this cultural collision would unfold. The studio seemed simultaneously intimate and vast, a crucible where identities would be tested, where music and morality were about to collide in a moment destined to be remembered. From this charged atmosphere emerged a sense of inevitability. Something unprecedented was about to happen. The nation, divided but attentive, would soon bear witness to not only a performance, but a confrontation that would resonate far beyond the walls of the television studio. Elvis took a slow, deliberate step toward the stage entrance, feeling the pulse of 1,000 eyes upon him. Every heartbeat seemed amplified, reverberating with the weight of expectation. And as the music began to swell softly from the orchestra pit, he inhaled, steadying himself, aware that the coming minutes could define not just his career, but the very perception of what he represented. Here, in this crucible of light and shadow, applause and suspicion, he was about to meet the storm, a moment that would test his artistry, his faith, and the very essence of his humanity. The stage, prepared with meticulous precision, awaited his presence. The cameras focused, the lights brightened, and the audience hushed in collective anticipation, sensing that the quiet before the storm was no ordinary pause, but the breath of history itself. The lights in the studio were harsh, gleaming like frozen suns, each beam cutting through the smoke and anticipation that hung over the set. Cameras clicked and whirred, as if trying to capture the heartbeat of the room itself. Elvis stood just off stage, the subtle weight of the moment pressing on his shoulders. He had performed countless times, yet tonight's energy was different. More intimate, more electric, charged with the invisible electricity of both expectation and judgment. The audience's murmurs rippled through the studio like water, sometimes soft, sometimes rising to an undercurrent of tension, their eyes darting between the cameras and the figure waiting to step into the spotlight. At first, the program moved like any other broadcast. The host, a polished figure with a smile too practiced to feel genuine, introduced Elvis with warmth, emphasizing his triumphant return. There were nods, applause, and the kind of polite cheer that filled many early television shows. Elvis's smile was calm, almost imperceptible, and his eyes reflected years of experience, an awareness that beyond the lights and applause, other forces were silently observing. He knew this audience was fragmented. Some would cheer simply because they loved his music. Others were waiting to see him stumble under scrutiny. And somewhere in the wings was the man who had made the headlines, whose presence now threatened to cast a shadow over the evening. Without warning, the host's tone shifted. There was a tightness, a deliberate pause, as he cleared his throat. "Tonight, we have a special guest," he announced, his eyes flicking toward a side entrance. "A man who has a message for all of America, especially for those concerned about the influence of pop culture on our youth. Please welcome Reverend Samuel Hargrove." The name alone was enough to stir unease. The studio audience, already buzzing with anticipation, stilled as the tall, stern-faced clergyman stepped into the light. His black suit and neatly pressed collar contrasted sharply with the casual elegance of the musicians and crew. There was a deliberate gravity to his movements, as if every step carried the weight of an unshakable conviction. The Reverend's eyes scanned the audience, lingering briefly on Elvis. A faint, almost imperceptible smile played across his lips, though it was devoid of warmth. He began speaking, his voice resonant and forceful, filling the studio with the authority of someone who believed he held moral truth. "The work performed on this stage tonight," he said, pointing in Elvis's direction, "is nothing short of a corruption of the spirit. The music you hear, the gyrations, the rhythm, the seductive lyrics, leads the young away from God and into temptation. This is the work of the devil." Each word landed with deliberate weight, punctuated by the slight nodding of a few audience members who appeared convinced of the veracity of his warning. Others shifted uneasily in their seats, exchanging nervous glances, unsure whether to cheer or recoil. Elvis remained silent. He did not flinch, did not laugh, and did not attempt to interrupt. His posture was straight, hands relaxed at his sides, as if the energy of the room flowed through him without touching his core. The cameras, sensing the drama, zoomed in, capturing the tension in every facial expression, from the hardened resolve of the Reverend to the varied reactions of the audience. Some were shocked, mouths opening and closing without sound. Others whispered fervently to neighbors, their voices low but urgent. A few teenage fans clenched their fists, their knuckles white, their eyes ablaze with unspoken defiance. The air was thick, a tangible tension that seemed to suspend time itself. The Reverend continued, undeterred by the silence from the man he sought to condemn. "Every movement, every note, every gesture from this man is a calculated act to ensnare the young," he intoned. "Parents must recognize the danger before it is too late. The soul of a generation hangs in the balance. His words, broadcast in real time to millions across the country, had the intended effect on some. Letters to newspapers, phone calls to churches, and frantic debates over dinner tables erupted the moment the show aired. Yet within the studio, the Reverend had underestimated something: the power of quiet composure. His authority might sway a portion of the viewing public, but it could not touch the calm confidence emanating from Elvis. The audience was fractured almost instantly. From the front rows came scattered applause, hesitant and polite, meant to affirm the Reverend's warning. Behind them, however, a ripple of resistance moved through the crowd, a soft murmur that grew into whispered exclamations of loyalty and admiration. "That's not true," someone hissed. "Elvis is amazing." Another voice, louder this time, declared, "He's one of us." The studio's mood oscillated between tension and support, fear and admiration. Every heartbeat seemed magnified, every breath a drumbeat in a growing symphony of uncertainty. The cameras captured it all. The visual duality of America itself. Divided, yet united in the shared intensity of the moment. As the Reverend reached the height of his speech, a deliberate pause punctuated his words. He glanced at the cameras, eyes narrowing, as if daring the audience to challenge his authority. A faint shuffling echoed across the stage, the hum of electricity mingling with the quiet hum of expectation. Then, a sudden ripple of applause erupted from a section of the crowd: students, young adults, and fans who had traveled miles to see Elvis. Their support was vocal, spontaneous, a wave of defiance against what they perceived as an attack not only on their music, but on their freedom, their right to feel, to live, to express themselves. The applause built in volume, filling the studio until it almost drowned out the Reverend's remaining words. Cameras swung from side to side, capturing the collision of perspectives, the rigidity of belief against the fluidity of human admiration. In that charged atmosphere, something remarkable occurred. The studio became a stage for more than music, for more than confrontation. It became a crucible in which the values, fears, and hopes of an entire nation were being tested in real time. Each glance between Elvis and the Reverend carried unspoken tension. The audience's divided reactions formed an almost physical presence, pressing in from every angle, as if the walls themselves could feel the pulse of a country suspended between fear and exhilaration. In those moments, it became clear that this evening would not be remembered merely as a television appearance. It would be recalled as a collision of eras: tradition versus modernity, restraint versus passion, fear versus faith. As the Reverend's final words lingered in the air, the audience held its collective breath, waiting for what would come next. Would Elvis falter? Would he explode? Or would he respond in a way no one could predict, a response that might transform this confrontation into something far greater than either side anticipated? The cameras focused, the lights flared, and for a fleeting heartbeat, the world seemed to stop, balanced precariously on the edge of revelation. In that precise instant, the nation waited, watching, listening, feeling. The collective tension, a silent drumbeat that heralded the beginning of a moment that would become legend. The studio lights blazed relentlessly, and for a long moment, the room seemed frozen in suspended anticipation. The Reverend's words had hung in the air, heavy and uncompromising, and the audience's reactions created a tidal wave of tension, swelling and receding with every murmur, gasp, and tentative applause. The cameras shifted, zooming in on faces that reflected shock, curiosity, and allegiance in equal measure. On stage, Elvis stood still, calm, a figure of poise amid the storm that had erupted around him. His eyes scanned the audience, landing on familiar faces and strangers alike, the weight of expectation pressing on him, yet not breaking his composure. He had seen suspicion, judgment, and misinterpretation before, but tonight felt different. Tonight, the stakes seemed monumental, as if every heartbeat in that room was magnified by millions watching from their living rooms across the country. Finally, the host, his practiced smile gone, leaned forward with an air of hesitant reverence. "Elvis," he said quietly, almost as if speaking would shatter the fragile tension. "Would you like to respond?" The audience leaned forward in unison, the collective inhalation of nearly 1,000 people palpable, as if the studio itself were holding its breath. Even the Reverend, rigid in posture and unwavering in his moral certainty, turned toward Elvis with a mixture of expectation and incredulity. For a moment, silence claimed the room entirely, punctuated only by the subtle hum of electricity from the stage lights and the soft shifting of feet on the polished floor. Then Elvis spoke. His voice was measured, calm, and unassuming, carrying neither defiance nor arrogance, but a sincerity that demanded attention in a way no shouting or argument could achieve. "I hear your concern," he began, and the clarity of his words cut through the residual echoes of accusation. "I understand that what I do on stage may seem wild, or shocking, or even corrupting to some. But you must know, I did not come here to harm. I came here to sing, to give voice to what lives in my heart, just as you give voice to yours in prayer." His eyes glimmered in the studio lights, capturing the audience in a gaze that was both direct and gentle, commanding attention without demanding it. "I grew up in Tupelo," he continued, "in a small house with my mother and father, where the pews of our local church became my first stage. The hymns, the prayers, the music we sang, those were my first lessons in what it means to lift your voice to the heavens." His voice wavered slightly, the subtle tremor betraying the depth of the emotion behind his measured tone. "Before I ever sang a popular song, before I ever appeared on television, I sang 'Peace in the Valley.' It gave me hope when there was none, courage when I felt small. It taught me the power of faith in music." The words, simple yet profound, spread through the studio like warm sunlight, illuminating the hearts of those present with an unexpected gentleness. Elvis paused, letting the weight of his confession settle over the audience. The Reverend's brows knitted slightly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his otherwise stoic face. He had expected anger, maybe defensiveness, perhaps a retort steeped in provocation. But not this, not honesty, not a voice that carried the echoes of the very faith he claimed was absent from modern music. The host, sensing the magnitude of the moment, remained silent, his eyes wide, the microphone inches from his lips as if he, too, were unsure whether the moment should be interrupted. Around the room, the audience shifted, the previously tense energy giving way to a quiet attentiveness, a collective leaning in, as if drawn by an invisible magnet of sincerity. Elvis continued, his words flowing effortlessly, as if they had been waiting all these years for the right moment to be spoken aloud. "If the music I make is from the devil, then the devil must have learned how to pray, because in every note, in every melody, I feel something greater than myself. I feel hope. I feel love. I feel the same spirit I first encountered in church, in those simple hymns that echoed off the wooden walls of my childhood sanctuary." A murmur passed through the crowd, soft at first, then growing as people exchanged glances, nodding subtly, their expressions softening in response to the vulnerability and truth in his voice. Even a few who had clutched their Bibles tightly now lowered them, unsure how to reconcile the man before them with the demonized figure the media had so recently constructed. The studio cameras captured every flicker of emotion, the skeptical scowl of a few audience members, the tears glistening in the eyes of others, the astonishment etched onto the faces of those who had only come to witness a confrontation. Elvis's words were a bridge, spanning the gulf of misunderstanding, spanning decades of judgment, bridging generations of expectation and fear. His voice, calm but resonant, transformed accusation into reflection, tension into contemplation. "Music is not a weapon," he said softly, almost a whisper now, yet every word crystal clear. "It is a companion, a healer, a teacher. The songs I sing are meant to lift, to comfort, to remind us that even in darkness, there is light." A hush fell over the room, heavier than any applause or laughter, filled with a reverent acknowledgement that truth sometimes arrives in subtle, unassuming forms rather than grand declarations. The Reverend opened his mouth, perhaps to speak, perhaps to counter, yet the words seemed to falter. For the first time he hesitated, caught in a moment of uncertainty, as if realizing that the simplistic division between right and wrong, between sacred and profane, might not be so clear after all. The audience's reaction, now almost palpable, pressed in with an undeniable force. Some rose from their seats, hands trembling, silently moved by the depth of the confession they had just witnessed. Others simply exhaled, shoulders sagging as if released from an unseen burden. The air itself seemed transformed, charged with something almost sacred, a quiet energy that no words could diminish. In that suspended, breathless silence, Elvis delivered the final stroke, a phrase that would be repeated across the nation in the days and weeks to come. "If this is the work of the devil, then the devil must have learned to pray, because the spirit that carries me forward, that gives life to my voice, has always carried me closer to God than I ever imagined." The studio did not erupt immediately. There was no instant applause, no sudden outburst. Instead, there was a moment of pure comprehension, a collective intake of breath, a shared acknowledgement that something profound had occurred. And then, slowly, almost reverently, the room began to respond, claps rising from scattered pockets, growing into a wave, faces lighting up with astonishment and admiration, some moved to tears by the unexpected clarity and humanity of a man who had been misunderstood for years. The cameras captured it all, broadcasting not only the confrontation but the quiet triumph of sincerity over spectacle, of authenticity over accusation. In that instant, the audience, the nation, and even the Reverend witnessed something that could not be scripted. The power of honesty, the transformative force of music, and the revelation that a voice, when rooted in truth, could defy fear, judgment, and expectation. The morning newspapers hit the streets like cannon fire, splintering the quiet routine of the city with screaming headlines and glossy photographs of Elvis, mid-gesture, captured in the ethereal glow of the stage lights. From New York to New Orleans, towns small and large were already buzzing. On Main Street in Memphis, the newspaper stand was crowded with people debating the implications. Elvis versus the church. Who won? One headline demanded, in stark black letters that seemed to jump from the page. Storefronts posted the day's editions in their windows, and the streets thrummed with the hum of conversation, speculation, and outrage. It was as if the nation itself had inhaled sharply, and no one knew how to exhale. In the South, the backlash was immediate and fierce. Churchgoers gathered on steps and lawns, holding their morning services in the open air, pamphlets pressed into hands that trembled with conviction. In Baton Rouge and Jackson, activists piled Elvis records onto makeshift pyres, lighting them with an almost ritualistic fervor, as if cleansing the youth from some unseen corruption. Their chants were loud, rhythmic, and insistent. The Reverend's words from the broadcast reverberated through the humid air, carried by the wind into every corner of the neighborhood. "Beware the music of the devil! Protect your children!" they cried. Parents scolded their teenagers for humming the latest Elvis tune, and shopkeepers refused to play his records in stores. The cultural earthquake was felt in every corner where faith and moral authority intersected, shaking old assumptions and forcing difficult questions about music, morality, and influence. Meanwhile, in Memphis, a different kind of energy swelled. Outside Graceland, fans had begun to gather almost immediately after the broadcast, their signs bright and handmade. "Elvis, our voice of freedom. Sing for us, King." Faith in music. Some held posters that featured photographs of a young Elvis in a suit, hands lifted in prayer, while others carried scraps of newspaper, the front page still smeared with ink from hurried presses. The crowd was diverse: teenagers with wide eyes and untamed hair, mothers holding infants while singing quietly along to a distant tune, older men tipping their hats in solemn acknowledgement. The air smelled faintly of sweat, exhaust, and the rich floral perfume of spring blooms, a stark contrast to the rigid scent of incense and polished wood that filled the southern churches where protest had just erupted. In the midst of it all, Graceland seemed almost to breathe, its gates serving as both sanctuary and symbol, drawing people in with a gravity that no headline could fully contain. Elvis, sequestered within the privacy of the mansion, was painfully aware of the uproar, but did not yet address it publicly. He wandered the familiar halls, touching the worn railings and polished banisters with a reverent gentleness, absorbing the quiet before the storm. His reflection in the mirrors was familiar yet haunted. The calm exterior that had steadied him in the studio seemed almost fragile when confronted by the enormity of a nation debating the morality of his very existence. For years he had lived between the flashes of stage lights and the quiet darkness of hotel rooms, yet never had the tension felt so sharply, so intimately, as it did now. Even in the comfort of his home, surrounded by family and a few loyal friends, the echoes of both praise and condemnation reverberated in his mind. He understood more clearly than ever that his music was no longer merely entertainment. It had become a mirror of societal struggle, a battlefield for the clash between old values and emerging freedoms. The newspapers, television commentaries, and radio broadcasts only amplified the polarization. In New York, a conservative columnist penned a scathing piece declaring Elvis the symbol of moral decay, while across the country, a jazz critic described him as a singer who channels the sacred through popular art. Letters poured into television networks and newspapers alike, some laced with vitriol, others brimming with gratitude and admiration. The sheer intensity of the reactions was overwhelming. Elvis had expected criticism, of course, but the depth and speed of national response startled even him. For every burning record, there was a fan waiting outside Graceland with a tear-streaked face, ready to cheer, ready to defend. The contrast was stark, visceral, and impossible to ignore. Amid this cultural maelstrom, a subtle yet powerful shift began to take shape. Some clergy who had initially sided with condemnation began to reflect. In small churches in Tennessee and Mississippi, pastors quietly replayed recordings of his gospel performances, nodding to themselves in contemplation. One minister, whose congregation had been skeptical, noted the fervent sincerity in Elvis's renditions of hymns and began including similar songs in the service. The idea that music could both entertain and uplift, that it could exist at the intersection of artistry and spirituality, was slowly gaining traction. Yet, at the same time, more rigid factions dug in their heels, reinforcing the binary narrative of good versus evil. The tension was not merely cultural, it was spiritual, personal, and generational. And it played out not only on television screens, but in living rooms, kitchens, and church halls across America. In the midst of this national conversation, Elvis chose silence. Not out of fear, but out of reflection. He understood the weight of words and the fragility of interpretation. Though some journalists begged for comment, some activists demanded denouncement, and fans clamored for reassurance, he remained quiet, absorbing the reactions and letting the moment unfold organically. There was pain in this silence, a quiet ache in seeing beloved music attacked. Yet there was also clarity. He recognized that the most profound responses would not come from a printed statement or a rehearsed speech, but from the living, breathing connection between his music and those who listened with open hearts. For the first time in a long while, Elvis felt the gravity of being not only a performer, but a symbol, a man whose voice could provoke outrage, inspire faith, and challenge assumptions all at once. By evening, the streets around Graceland were alive with a low, reverent energy. Families strolled together, singing softly to the tune of a familiar melody, while teenagers lingered near the gates, heads tilted, listening to the distant echo of records playing from cars. Some neighbors peered out from their porches, drawn by the movement of the crowd, unsure whether to scold or celebrate. Inside, Elvis walked through the quiet rooms, pausing at the piano, touching the keys without playing. He could almost hear the heartbeat of the nation. The love, the criticism, the hope, the fear, all interwoven into a tapestry of tension that was as beautiful as it was daunting. He understood then that the broadcast, the confrontation, and the ensuing uproar had transformed him irrevocably. He was no longer just Elvis Presley, the entertainer. He had become a focal point for a deeper, more complex conversation about music, morality, and faith in a changing America. The phone rang in the quiet of Graceland late one evening, its sharp tones slicing through the silence that had settled like a warm blanket over the sprawling estate. Elvis, still dressed in a simple white shirt and slacks from the day's rehearsals, paused mid-step in the hallway, the echo of footsteps lingering on the polished wood floors. He hesitated before picking it up, the receiver cool against his ear, carrying the weight of both expectation and uncertainty. On the other end, a voice trembled. Not with anger, not with accusation, but with gratitude, and an almost imperceptible hint of urgency. It was the voice of a woman from a small town in Tennessee, soft yet clear, bearing the kind of authenticity that only comes from real human struggle. Her story spilled out in halting sentences, each word weighted with love and concern. Her son, she explained, was blind, a child whose world had always been limited to shapes and sounds, a young life where imagination had to fill in the endless gaps left by darkness. The child had discovered Elvis's gospel recordings almost by accident, and there was one song in particular, Peace in the Valley, that had become a lifeline. Every night, the boy would sit in his small bedroom, eyes closed, head tipped toward the faint hum of the phonograph, letting the music wash over him in waves that seemed to carry hope directly into his heart. The mother's voice cracked as she told Elvis how the song had helped him through moments of despair, how he would hum along, not knowing the words entirely, but feeling every note as if it were a hand placed gently on his shoulder, a silent promise that he was not alone. Elvis listened in near silence, the words unfolding like delicate petals inside him. For the first time since the controversy had erupted, the intensity of public opinion, the criticism, the outrage, the polarized headlines, felt distant, almost irrelevant. Here was something profoundly real, intimate, unmediated by television screens or newspaper columns, the raw, unfiltered impact of his music on a life struggling in the shadow of darkness. He could almost see the small bedroom, the blind boy swaying slightly in rhythm, the tender care of a mother who had become both protector and translator for a world her child could not see. Without thinking, Elvis spoke softly, each word measured and deliberate. He thanked her, not as a celebrity acknowledging a fan, but as a man humbled by the weight of genuine human connection. He asked about the boy's favorite parts of the song, inquired about what gave him the most comfort, and listened with an attentiveness that made the mother's voice falter, overcome with emotion. There was no pretense, no performance, only the careful, deliberate attention of someone who understood that real influence is measured not in applause or record sales, but in the quiet victories of hearts touched. By the time the call ended, Elvis had made a decision that would surprise even his closest confidants. He would visit this family, not as a celebrity arriving with flashing cameras and throngs of fans, but incognito, like any ordinary visitor, carrying nothing but his presence and the music that had defined him. The logistics were delicate. He coordinated quietly with the family, ensuring privacy, arranging for the most unassuming arrival. Graceland's servants and a small circle of aides were sworn to secrecy, the air thick with anticipation and a strange sort of reverence. No one was to speak of the visit publicly. It was meant to be a private communion, a bridge built with notes and melody, rather than headlines and rhetoric. The journey itself was unremarkable, almost mundane in its ordinariness, which was precisely the point. Elvis traveled through winding roads that cut through stretches of farmland, past white picket fences, barns weathered gray with age, and small-town streets lined with shuttered shops. It was the kind of travel that forced introspection, the kind of journey where the landscape, familiar yet quietly foreign, mirrors the internal rhythms of thought and feeling. He reflected on the days that had led to this moment, the television confrontation, the newspapers that had dissected his every gesture, the polarized cries of praise and condemnation. And yet, for all the noise and spectacle, it was this silent connection, this invitation into someone else's life, that held the truest significance. Arriving at the family home, Elvis was greeted by the mother's quiet tears and the boy's hesitant curiosity. There were no lights, no announcement, no fanfare, only the soft creak of the front door, the warm smell of a simple home-cooked meal lingering faintly in the air, and the almost tangible tension of anticipation that accompanied any profound human encounter. The boy reached out, guided by intuition rather than sight, and touched Elvis's hand, feeling the warmth and solidity there. No words were exchanged immediately. The moment itself spoke volumes, a silence rich with the unspoken understanding that something meaningful was unfolding. Then Elvis sang. Not a grand performance, no projected voice for an audience of thousands, no stage lights or camera lenses to frame the moment. Just him, the boy, and the mother, with peace in the valley, rising gently from the small living room, each note deliberate, each phrase infused with care. The music seemed to wrap around the boy like a protective cloak, filling the spaces darkness could not touch, offering hope without demands, faith without judgment. The mother's hand rested lightly on her son's shoulder, tears slipping freely now, not from despair, but from relief and awe. The boy hummed along, soft and uneven, but fully engaged, as if every note were a thread stitching together a tapestry of courage, comfort, and trust. Elvis watched quietly, his heart swelling with the quiet power of connection. This was proof, irrefutable and intimate, that the music he had feared might be misunderstood, mischaracterized, or maligned had a purpose far deeper than public approval or condemnation. He felt a sense of peace that had eluded him during the heated debates, the shouting matches, and the relentless scrutiny. Here, in this small, dimly lit home, the controversy of the world seemed to dissolve, replaced by something purer, something that could not be measured by charts or headlines, a living testament to the power of music to heal, uplift, and bridge divides. When he finally departed, leaving the home as quietly as he had arrived, Elvis carried with him a renewed sense of purpose. The impact of his art was no longer abstract, no longer subject to the whims of critics or the fervor of moral authorities. It was tangible, real, and deeply human. And in the weeks and months to come, as the nation continued to debate and divide, Elvis would remember this small encounter as a guiding light, a reminder that the truth of one song, one act of sincerity, could speak louder than any clamor of judgment or applause. The reverberations of the television broadcast lingered long after the screen had gone dark. In the days that followed, the world seemed to hold its breath, caught between shock and awe. Yet while many fans replayed the show in their minds, marveling at the calm authority of Elvis's words, there was one man who refused to let the moment go so easily. The same preacher who had condemned him live on air, his robes still carrying the faint scent of incense and polished wood from the studio, sat at his desk late at night, poring over notes, sermons, and hastily scribbled letters from congregants. His anger was palpable, a storm coiling behind his eyes. But it was no longer just outrage, it had evolved into obsession. He drafted a new message, sharper this time, his fingers moving with a fervor born of indignation. This sermon, he promised himself, would be unyielding, unflinching, and would leave no room for misinterpretation. He would expose what he still insisted was the true nature of the music, the moral danger lurking beneath the seductive rhythms. He imagined it broadcast across the South, carried by radio waves into living rooms, churches, and school auditoriums, a thunderbolt aimed directly at the young hearts he believed were at risk. Yet the more he prepared, the more he sensed the shifting tide. Letters arrived not just of agreement, but of quiet defiance. Congregants who had once nodded with unquestioning acceptance now questioned his condemnation, their words tinged with wonder at the humanity, the spirituality, the sheer sincerity they had witnessed in Elvis's response. It started small. A few ministers, initially cautious, began incorporating gospel recordings into their services. One Sunday in Memphis, a well-known pastor played "How Great Thou Art" for the first time during his sermon. He watched the congregation, expecting confusion, perhaps dissent. Instead, he saw hands raised, eyes closed, and tears glistening on cheeks. His parishioners whispered the words together, collectively experiencing the song not as entertainment, but as prayer, as a bridge between heaven and earth. Reports of similar occurrences began to trickle in from other towns, small but undeniable signs of change in the spiritual landscape. Journalists, always hungry for tension, began to document this unexpected development. Articles appeared with headlines like "Elvis, Catalyst for a New Kind of Faith," and "From Controversy to Reverence, Music's Power Tested." Reporters attended church services, spoke with pastors, and recorded the hesitant, transformative reactions of parishioners. They noted how critics were beginning to split into factions, some doubling down on denunciation, others slowly acknowledging that perhaps Elvis's music could inspire rather than corrupt. It was a schism that mirrored the earlier societal divisions he had become a symbol for. But this time, the divide cut through religious lines, opening up conversations that had long been considered taboo in conservative circles. Elvis, back in the controlled chaos of Graceland, followed these developments quietly. He did not seek credit, nor did he delight in the unfolding debate. He simply observed, aware that his music had created a ripple far beyond what anyone, including himself, could have predicted. Letters arrived, some written by ministers, others by laypeople, all recounting the same thing. Moments of private revelation sparked by songs he had sung decades earlier. A pastor in Mississippi wrote of a young man who, inspired by Peace in the Valley, had reconciled with his estranged father after years of silence. A small-town Sunday school teacher described children kneeling in prayer to the accompaniment of Elvis's gospel recordings, learning empathy and humility in ways traditional instruction had never achieved. Meanwhile, the preacher who had intended to denounce him found his audience diminishing. His sermons, once packed with fervor and applause, now drew mixed reactions, murmurs of doubt threading through the pews. He noticed more parishioners leaving quietly, their eyes downcast, unsettled by a truth they could not ignore. Music, when delivered with sincerity and spiritual grounding, could awaken the soul rather than corrupt it. He could feel the walls of certainty beginning to crack, a slow erosion he could neither stop nor ignore. His planned second broadcast, meant to be his triumph, now felt precarious, his authority challenged not by an external force, but by the undeniable resonance of truth in hearts he had once assumed were blind to anything but fear. One evening, as the preacher paced his office, he received a letter from a colleague, a minister in Louisiana, who had been critical of Elvis at first. The letter recounted the transformation of his congregation, their growing willingness to explore the gospel embedded in the music, and the young people returning to church who had previously drifted away. The words were measured, respectful, but they carried an undeniable weight. The song that had once been branded "the devil's work" was now a bridge, guiding people toward reflection, repentance, and, in some cases, joy. Elvis, meanwhile, prepared for his next public performance. He knew that the energy surrounding him was no longer simply about entertainment. It had become a dialogue, a test of authenticity, faith, and the enduring capacity of music to move people. His friends and bandmates felt the tension, too. Every note played, every lyric sung, carried a symbolic weight that transcended melody. This concert would not merely be judged on skill or showmanship, but on its ability to continue what had begun quietly in living rooms, Sunday schools, and church halls across the South. The stakes were subtle yet profound. Could music alone, when imbued with honesty and spirituality, challenge prejudice, provoke reflection, and inspire unity? The country seemed suspended in anticipation, the echoes of a televised confrontation still resonating, amplified by letters, sermons, and whispered stories of changed lives. For the first time, Elvis understood fully that the battle was no longer with critics or denouncers. It was a spiritual and cultural conversation in which he had become an unwitting participant. And as he looked out over Graceland's sprawling lawns that evening, the twilight sky casting long shadows over familiar paths, he realized that true influence, the kind that mattered most, was measured not by applause or condemnation, but by the quiet, profound, often invisible ways people's hearts were moved. The Las Vegas showroom was a cathedral of light and sound, a spectacle that could swallow even the most confident performer. As the night descended, a peculiar tension had already settled over the audience, one that was invisible yet palpable. Velvet curtains hung like dark waves at the back of the stage, reflecting glimmers of gold from the chandeliers. The air smelled faintly of perfume, cigarette smoke, and anticipation. Camera crews lined the balconies, their lenses trained on the stage, ready to capture every gesture, every flicker of expression. Journalists, some still smarting from the televised confrontation weeks earlier, scribbled notes feverishly, their eyes darting between the crowd and the dressing room door where Elvis was rumored to appear at any moment. Backstage, Elvis sat quietly, alone in the dim glow of the vanity lights. His reflection stared back at him, sharp cheekbones shadowed by the soft gold, eyes that had seen triumph and criticism alike, lips pressed together in thought. The familiar energy of the crowd thrumming outside contrasted with an undercurrent of anxiety that few would recognize. He understood the unspoken reality. Every step, every note, every movement would be dissected. Critics would measure his intent as much as his talent, and some would be waiting to pounce, eager to define him yet again, to frame him as a moral threat, a cautionary tale. Yet there was also another force at work: faith, sincerity, and the undeniable connection he had built with his audience over decades. As the orchestra began the prelude, a ripple of applause surged through the room. It was not uniform. Here and there, skeptical voices rose, their words slicing the hum of expectation. "Devil's music." Some sneered, arms folded, faces hardened with judgment. But these voices were quickly overtaken by waves of support, cheer after cheer reverberating through the seats. Every note from the strings, every gentle beat of the percussion, seemed to pulse in alignment with the collective heartbeat of the audience. They were ready, not just for a performance, but for a declaration, a testament. Elvis stepped into the spotlight, the glow catching the sequins of his suit, making him shimmer like a man half-formed from light and shadow. He paused, the silence holding for a fraction longer than comfort, letting the moment stretch, letting anticipation thicken. The crowd exhaled as one, a tidal wave of sound that mixed excitement with apprehension. Every eye in the room was fixed on him, some with reverence, others with skepticism, all aware that tonight was more than music. Tonight was the continuation of a dialogue that had started in a television studio, a conversation about belief, culture, and the power of art to challenge, heal, and unify. And then the first note rang out. It was tentative at first, a careful probing of the space, testing the atmosphere. But as he found the rhythm, confidence infused each chord, each syllable. Fans leaned forward, caught in the magnetic force of a voice that could command without raising its volume, that could charm without a single performative flourish. Yet the critics' murmurs persisted, and a few hecklers, emboldened by alcohol or principle, shouted into the air, "This is corruption!" The words were sharp, a jagged intrusion into the smooth fabric of the music. Elvis paused mid-song, the band faltering just slightly behind him. He turned, the spotlight capturing the intensity in his eyes. There was no anger, no retaliation, only presence, a deliberate calm that commanded attention. The room, sensing the gravity, fell into a hushed expectance. Every breathing person seemed to hold their own, waiting, watching. He stepped forward to the microphone, and his voice, low and resonant, cut through the tension like sunlight through storm clouds. "I know there are those who think this music leads to darkness," he said, words deliberate, weighty. "But I also know that music has lifted us when nothing else could. It has comforted the weary, inspired the lost, and reminded us that we are alive, capable of joy, and deserving of hope." A collective shiver passed through the audience. The skeptics looked around, unsettled by the honesty radiating from the stage. The loyal fans, however, erupted quietly in agreement, nodding, wiping tears, gripping hands. The contrast was stark. Doubt and conviction existing side by side, locked in a fragile, tense truce that seemed ready to shatter at any misstep. He signaled to the orchestra to resume, and this time the music carried a new weight, a deliberate blend of power and intimacy. It was no longer a simple performance, it was a statement. The choreography, subtle yet charged, echoed the tension of the moment. Every sway, every glance, every beat synchronized with the emotional rhythm of the room. Critics, for once, could not ignore the sincerity, the connection he was forging. Even those who had come to challenge him found themselves caught in the wave, their objections muted by the undeniable truth of the experience. By the middle of the set, the audience had shifted. The skeptics had quieted, the hecklers' voices lost in the tide of engagement. Some had leaned forward, curious now rather than combative. Others sat in stunned silence, watching the man on stage transform a concert hall into a space that felt almost sacred. Each song built upon the last, not merely entertainment, but a subtle reclamation of narrative. Elvis asserting that the spirit behind the music was as vital as the music itself. And as the final chords of the evening approached, the room vibrated with a unity that was nearly tangible. What had started as a venue filled with divided opinions and wary anticipation had become an arena of collective awe, a space where music transcended its form, where faith and artistry collided, not in conflict, but in resonance. Every heartbeat matched the rhythm of the final notes. Every pair of eyes reflected the same astonishment. The realization that tonight the stage had become more than a platform. It had become a mirror of America's own conflicted soul, caught between tradition and transformation. The spotlight settled into a soft, golden glow, painting the edges of the stage with a warmth that felt almost sacred. The orchestra had paused, the hall hanging in a suspenseful quiet, as if the entire world had drawn a collective breath. Every pair of eyes was fixed on Elvis, not as an entertainer, but as a messenger of something far larger than applause or spectacle. The moment demanded more than music. It demanded honesty, an unveiling of the soul. The air was thick with electricity, not the frenetic kind of rock and roll that had made him famous, but a charged, solemn energy that seemed to hum in harmony with every pulse in the room. Elvis shifted, just slightly, his posture relaxed, yet purposeful. He let his gaze wander across the audience, pausing on faces that reflected admiration, skepticism, curiosity, and even disbelief. Each expression seemed to carry a fragment of America itself, a nation torn between convention and liberation, between condemnation and understanding, between fear and the deep, aching desire to be moved. And in that gaze, he found the clarity he had been seeking, not in criticism, nor in the applause, but in the silent connection with those who came expecting a show, yet were about to witness something transformative. He took a deep breath, letting it fill the room with its subtle intensity. His voice, when it came, was low, resonant, carrying a weight of experience and sincerity that only years of life and reflection could provide. "I grew up singing in church," he said softly, almost like a confession. Every hymn, every gospel song, every note was a prayer. And even now, when I sing, it's still a prayer. If God is against music, then why do I feel Him most in the songs I love? The words landed like stones tossed into a still pond. The hall was motionless, every breath held, every eye widening in recognition of the vulnerability and courage in that simple declaration. It was not arrogance, it was not defiance, it was truth, raw and unshielded, emanating from a man who had been called everything from a cultural icon to a moral danger, and who now claimed his space with humility rather than aggression. Then, without a cue or fanfare, he began to sing. A cappella. The first note emerged from deep within his chest, clear and resonant, filling the cavernous space with a purity that seemed almost impossible given the tension of the night. It was, "How great thou art," stripped of all embellishment, stripped of every layer that might distract from its essence. The familiar melody wound through the air like a river of light, carrying with it a weight of memory, faith, and the collective longing of everyone present. The audience was arrested. The usual rustle of programs, the low murmurs of conversation, even the occasional cough, all vanished. It was as if the hall itself had surrendered, allowing the song to occupy every corner, every crevice, every heart. For the first time that evening, critics paused in their notebooks, their pens frozen mid-sentence. The skeptical murmurs from earlier had dissolved into an almost reverent hush. This was no longer a concert. It was a moment of spiritual revelation, a bridge between entertainer and listener, between doubt and belief. As he sang, the subtle tremor in his voice conveyed not weakness, but vulnerability transformed into strength. His hands were free at his sides, yet every subtle gesture, an extended arm, a slight tilt of the head, carried meaning. It was a performance stripped of performance, a display of human connection rather than artistry. Tears glistened in the eyes of the audience, glistening as much from recognition as from the sheer emotional force of the song. Parents clutched the hands of their children. Couples held each other closer. Strangers found themselves linked through shared experience, and a few hardened critics felt a stirring that defied professional detachment. Cameras rolled, capturing the moment for posterity, yet even the technological lenses could not fully contain the intimacy of what was unfolding. Fans raised hands instinctively, not as a gesture of fanfare, but as a silent acknowledgement of the transcendence before them. Some whispered prayers along with the melody, their voices fragile, tentative, yet potent. Even those who had come to judge, to critique, found themselves leaning in, drawn into the gravity of something bigger than the night, bigger than fame, bigger than controversy. Elvis's voice rose, not in volume, but in conviction. Each verse built upon the last, layering hope upon remembrance, faith upon resilience. The auditorium seemed to vibrate in tandem with his vocal resonance, creating a synergy that went beyond physical sound waves, a sensation that was as much emotional and spiritual as it was auditory. The performance became a mirror, reflecting the audience's inner lives, the doubts, the longings, the unspoken prayers that had been gathering dust in private hearts. As the final note lingered, delicate and haunting, the silence that followed was almost unbearable in its magnitude. No one moved, no one spoke. It was a silence heavy with realization, heavy with the weight of an experience that demanded reflection. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, applause began. One hand, then another, then a ripple that became a tide. But it was not the frenzied clapping of a rock concert. It was thoughtful, reverent, a recognition of authenticity. People rose, some with tears streaking their faces, some clasping their hands in awe, all bearing witness to the power of a song delivered not for entertainment, but for communion. Elvis paused, letting the echoes settle, allowing the emotion to breathe. His eyes swept the room once more, connecting, acknowledging, and, in that gaze, conveying gratitude, humility, and unwavering sincerity. For the first time that evening, The divisions in the room seemed to blur. The hecklers had quieted. The critics were hesitant to speak. The believers were moved beyond measure. In that instant, the performance transcended fame, beyond the spectacle of a Las Vegas showroom, beyond the glare of television cameras. It had become a shared experience, a testament to the enduring truth that music, at its core, could heal, unite, and reveal what words alone could not. And as he stepped back from the microphone, letting the silence hang before the applause, there was a sense that something profound had shifted, not just on the stage, but in the hearts of everyone present. The night had become sacred, not through ritual, but through presence, honesty, and the simple, unadorned beauty of a human voice reaching out across a room full of strangers and finding in them a shared spirit. The hall was still vibrating with the resonance of "How Great Thou Art." But the applause that had begun to swell was tempered by a profound hush that fell as Elvis lifted his hand, gently, almost imperceptibly, calling for quiet. The silence that followed was different from any the room had known. It was expectant, sacred, almost tangible. In that pause, every breath seemed amplified, every heartbeat audible, and every person in the audience felt as though time itself had bent to hold this moment. The applause, the cheers, the criticism, all of it had melted into a shared, delicate awareness. Something had shifted, and it was impossible to look away. Elvis's eyes swept the room once more. They were calm, but charged with an intensity that was both personal and universal. He did not speak to the skeptics, the journalists, or even the fanatics. He spoke to the humanity of the room. "I do not serve the devil," he said, his voice low, deliberate, carrying the weight of conviction that only comes from lived experience. "I sing for people, and if in this act there is even a spark of goodness, then God is with us." The words landed softly, but with the gravity of a judgment rendered not in accusation, but in undeniable truth. The audience shifted, almost collectively, as though releasing an invisible tension that had been building for years, through controversies, judgments, and the relentless scrutiny of a public that demanded both perfection and passion. Now, in the simplest of declarations, Elvis had reframed the entire evening. He had taken criticism and made it inconsequential. He had taken fear and replaced it with reflection. And most importantly, he had taken music, a source of division, accusation, and scandal, and transformed it into communion. For a heartbeat, the room was motionless. Some closed their eyes, letting the words wash over them. Others stared at him, struggling to reconcile the man before them with the caricature they had seen on magazine covers, television panels, and in the whispers of society. It was not just his voice that held them. It was the certainty of his presence, the unmistakable conviction of someone who had endured scandal, judgment, and relentless public scrutiny, yet remained unbroken and profoundly human. Then the applause began again, slowly at first, almost hesitant, but building like a tidal wave, unstoppable. It started with a few hands clapping tentatively, then more, until the entire hall erupted in a roar that was both celebratory and reverent. Some rose to their feet, tears streaking their cheeks, faces lifted in gratitude, amazement, and relief. Others stood silently, hands pressed together in gestures of prayer or respect, their previous doubts dissolving in the face of something larger than themselves. Even the critics, whose notebooks had been bristling with notes on scandal and controversy, found their pens useless. Some removed their glasses to blink away the moisture in their eyes, acknowledging in silence that they had witnessed a singular truth. Elvis remained still for a moment, letting the energy wash over him. He was aware of every heartbeat, every tear, every raised hand. This was the culmination of years of tension between cultural expectation and personal truth, between the spectacle of fame and the intimacy of human connection. He had sung not to prove anything, not to justify, not to argue, but simply to exist honestly in the presence of those willing to listen. And that honesty had transformed the night, the concert, and, in a sense, the conversation of an entire generation. The audience, sensing the intimacy of the moment, quieted once more, as if on cue. And in that silence, something profound happened. A recognition that the music, the voice, and the man behind it had transcended entertainment. It had become a vehicle for empathy, for unity, and for spiritual reflection. People looked at one another, strangers touched by the same invisible thread, a shared experience that defied words. Some clasped hands, others simply inhaled deeply, feeling an unfamiliar but welcome connection with those around them. The room was no longer divided between critics and fans, skeptics and believers, performers and audience. It had become a single organism, pulsing with the awareness of something true, beautiful, and timeless. Elvis lowered his head slightly, a subtle gesture of humility amidst the intensity of the moment. There was no need for grand gestures, no need for dramatic bows or flourish. The music had said everything that needed to be said. The silence that followed spoke louder than any fanfare ever could, echoing in the hearts of those present, etching itself into memory with a permanence that no critic's pen or journalist's lens could capture. As he stepped back from the microphone and allowed the orchestra to resume, the audience erupted once again, not simply in applause, but in an acknowledgement of transformation. The cheers were immense, but more importantly, they carried reverence, understanding, and a deep, visceral appreciation for authenticity. It was a moment of catharsis, a testament to the power of conviction delivered not through argument, but through art. And in that surge of emotion, even those who had arrived with doubt found themselves humbled, reminded that sometimes truth is revealed not in words of defense, but in the courage to simply be genuine. For millions of viewers watching on television, for thousands present in the hall, and for the generations who would hear the story retold in years to come, the evening became legendary. Elvis Presley was no longer just a performer, no longer merely the subject of scandal or gossip. He was a symbol of integrity, of the power of music to transcend judgment, to heal rifts, and to create a fleeting but unforgettable moment of unity. In a world accustomed to division, his voice had offered reconciliation. In a culture obsessed with spectacle, he had offered truth. And in that sacred silence that followed, the message was clear. The man and his music belonged to no one ideology or judgment, but to the human spirit itself, a testament to the enduring power of sincerity and the ineffable connection between artist and audience. The night ended, not with fireworks or curtain calls, but with quiet reflection. Hands slowly lowered, eyes still glistening, hearts still pounding, and a shared understanding that they had all been part of something extraordinary, something that would not be forgotten. And as the lights dimmed, the final image of Elvis on stage lingered in memory, not as a controversial figure or a symbol of rebellion, but as a voice, a soul, and a presence that had, for a single unforgettable night, reminded a nation of the capacity for goodness, unity, and transcendence in the simplest of acts, the act of singing truthfully.